Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us here at V.Group for our Navigating the New Normal conference, part of London International Shipping Week 2021. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us during an interesting and insightful week of events, regardless of whether you're joining the session live or viewing the recording. So today we have an exciting series of panel discussions focused on a number of ongoing issues affecting the maritime industry, including data, decarbonisation and crewing. Each panel will feature industry leaders with the aim of stimulating debate around navigating the new normal throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Our panellists are looking forward to answering your questions, which you can submit via the portal if you are joining us live. But first, to kick things off, I'd like to introduce our first three speakers who will set the scene for the day ahead. From left to right, we have Graham Westgarth, the chairman of V.Group, in addition to his role as vice president of the UK Chamber of Shipping. We also have Katie Adamson, futurist and renowned public speaker with a special interest in the maritime sector. And we also have Renée Kofoed-Olsen, chief executive officer of V.Group. So without further delay, I'll hand over to our three speakers to introduce themselves and outline the discussion for the day ahead. Thank you. Over to you, Graham.
Thank you, Rona, and welcome to everyone for what I hope will be a very interesting 3 or 4 hours ahead of us. I think the interesting thing, I think, is this industry has always been changing, but I think the pace of change over the next decade is going to increase exponentially. And I think today we're going to cover what I believe are the 3 key topics that need to be thought about and addressed in the near future. So I'm not sure today will provide you with any answers, but hopefully what we do is create thought, because I think if we can think about these things in the right way and collaborate in the right way, then we can the industry can come out in a much stronger position than it actually went into this particular scenario. So I think there may be challenges ahead, but there are also many opportunities, and hopefully we can highlight some of those in the course of the next few hours. So without further ado, I'm going to, I should say that the 3 key topics, which I'm sure you've seen on the agenda, are really digitalization, decarbonisation, and of course, crewing or manning. The last one is my favourite subject, because without people, then this industry simply doesn't work. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over at this stage to Renée.
Thank you very much, Graham. And again, thank you for joining us either here live or on the screen. We are very honored to have Katie here with us. It's really to inspire conversations around all the topics that is on our mind every single day, and particularly the long-haul nature of them, because as Graham is saying, we really can't perform our duties without people, but also there's no duties to perform without finding a route to decarbonizing, and sort of data plays into that. 71% of this fantastic planet is water. More than 90% of global trade is sort of waterborne. So I actually think we play a prominent role in that whole discussion and finding sort of the sustainable strategies for the future. And maybe as talking about the planet, then maybe decarbonization, Katie, is maybe the first discussion we should start on with.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the industry as a whole, decarbonisation and digitalisation. I mean, your topics are, I believe, very well chosen. But particularly digitalisation and decarbonisation have been front of mind and been on conference programmes for a long time now. But ultimately, I think we have to reframe the challenge here. And we talk about the shipping industry, but the reality is there isn't a shipping industry. There's a selection of sectors, that all operate at sea. And I think one of the criticisms that's often levelled at the industry is that IMO hasn't managed to legislate properly for this. We've got a lack of regulatory certainty, and that's absolutely true. But the reality is that the issues and the challenges that we're trying to deal with here are not limited to the sea. And IMO's remit is to regulate the sea and seagoing activities. So I think really what this boils down to is that there are some very big drivers across all businesses. And that means that if we say shipping is a collection of sectors, maybe the approach we should be taking is saying, rather than how do we decarbonize ships, how do we decarbonize the value chain, which ultimately ends up in you buying a pair of sneakers, or the value chain that ends up in you buying a car? Because then I think that reframes the debate. It makes it more relevant, because the relevance is this is not just about shipping, this is about the value chain and the customers that it serves and its entire ecosystem, to bring up my favorite buzzword. So I think all of the things that are going to be discussed today, you've got root causes underneath these, and they're applicable to all businesses, not just shipping. I'm not saying shipping isn't in a unique position. Of course it is. It operates in a harsh environment, all these various things. But actually, when you look at the business of shipping, how we get the investment, how we drive the change that we need, that's not something that shipping as an industry can do on its own. And the conversation needs to move on to, okay, how do we bring our customers, our suppliers, our wider stakeholders together to actually find the mechanisms to do this?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting conundrum, because having grown up in shipping, it somewhat seems like we are a closed ecosystem. And so I suppose what you're saying is also there's an educational process for all of us, that when our young sort of people are pressing the button and ordering those famous sneakers, they also understand how the whole ecosystem is working, right? And if you want to have them like tomorrow because you really like those sneakers, well, then you potentially do air freight and so on and so forth, and that just adds to the problem we all have. So is there sort of almost a groundswell movement in terms of the educational process, and probably data could play a big part, but as you mentioned, Graham, that manning and people, I mean, we can build the most fantastic assets, but right now, they need people, and in the total foreseeable future, they need people, and good people. And so being able to attract also the young people coming into this industry for all the right reasons, probably we need to be more humble and educate everybody on how is it to have a seagoing.
Yeah, but we also, you kind of said it, we also might want different types of people with different skill sets. And if we want them to be sailing our ships, or master of our ships in 10 years' time, we need to start thinking about what that looks like now. So, but just, Rennie, and Katie, just on you kind of touched on IMO legislation, Rennie, you touched upon an app where you can see the carbon footprint of a pair of trainers and the cost associated with that, and people will make choices. Do you think that the change, the decarbonisation agenda will be driven by legislation, or by actually the consumer, who ultimately will bear the cost of what will be trillions of dollars of investment on a global basis in the next little while? Just interested in your thoughts on that, maybe, Katie.
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, there was an initiative that I think it was Boston Consulting Group did last year, and they actually looked at the cost of a car and looked at what it would cost to completely decarbonise that supply chain. And I don't have the figures at my fingertips, but it was a comparatively small amount on the ultimate price of a $30,000 vehicle. Maybe it's $150 or something like that. And when you think of it in those terms, you actually begin to realise, and this carries on from really what I was just saying, that you have to look at the entire value chain and say, where does the investment need to come? But ultimately, if it's $150 to the end consumer, then that is probably acceptable. And if the consumer is educated and is looking for sustainable choices, then that is going to be even more likely to succeed. But there are a couple of issues here, because you have to collaborate to do that. And when we talk about regulation and legislation, the big challenges we face, they kind of run counter very often to things like competition law. So actually we need to be thinking not just about decarbonisation legislation, we need to be thinking about more broadly enabling regulation that allows more of these collaborations and conferences amongst value chains to actually enable them to take joint action. And in many respects that could be considered against competition law. So I think we need to have a wider conversation about what needs to happen here. And the idea, an app that shows you the carbon footprint of things, yes, consumers are beginning to demand those things, but at the consumer facing end, you've got people competing on is it $5 more for this or $2.50 for this on Amazon? You're getting ranked. If you're going to sell items on that basis, then any kind of increase in price at the consumer end is going to be difficult, which means you have to start, completely changing the conversation. And this is really where, a lot of the consumer brands are starting to go. They're no longer saying we're the cheapest. And that's important, because what we've tended to do is we've not priced in the real cost of the products and the services that we buy. I talk about the F word, free, yeah? We're told so many things are free. In actual fact, they're not free. They have a cost to the environment, they may have a cost to people, but we don't price those in. And I think this new ESG agenda, that we're all hearing about now, that really is an idea that says we should be reporting non-financial metrics. And when you do that, suddenly something that looks like it's a very profitable, high-margin business turns into something that isn't profitable at all. So, I think it's really important that, yes, shipping needs to be talking about decarbonisation, all these things, but we need to set it in the right context, which is we have to have our customers, our suppliers, the end consumers, understanding where the impacts to the environment are coming along the value chain, and make them understand that, no, this isn't free, it isn't low cost, it's actually very expensive. I mean, a container today, $8,000, it used to be $1,400, maybe it really does cost $8,000. This is the kind of thinking we should be saying. Maybe that is what it costs, and maybe that's what it should cost.
I think it's very interesting that the whole playing together, because you're asking, should it be binary legislation, should it be consumer driven? I think it should be all of that, and I think you need to sort of have an ecosystem where non-for-profit plays straight into for-profit, because it will follow capital. That's it. We should have efficient capital markets who understands, the future challenges are ahead of us, and therefore the best sustainable solution is where for-profit works together with both legislators and non-for-profit, and we are starting to see some investment in research, in the right sustainable mechanisms. Because if you're just coming with your finger held high, but you're not explaining why that is the case, I think you are paying lip service to a much bigger problem here. So there is an educational process. So as an industry, shipping has sort of been connecting countries and regions historically. I mean, that's where the whole global trade came from. And I used to live in West Africa, and seeing that we were able actually to connect the northern parts of Mali, which is a country I lived in, to China with a container or with aid or with seeds for farms is very humbling. And so if you understand the footprint of doing that, then I think governments and legislators can make decisions that enables that, but understanding what it actually costs to do it. And I think if we don't do that, you have a challenge on globalization. You'll have a challenge of attracting people into our industry. But at the same time, we also need to be very clear on what we need. So people are talking about liquid energy and so on is a thing of the past. It's not really. I mean, we really still need liquid energy in all its form, but you can start by ensuring that there is the right legislation on parts of the industry that is not delivering into those zero carbon situations like coal and so on.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things to be done, but it's a whole ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on your point about capital, because I don't think right now capital distinguishes between a company that, if you're going to bring in equity or debt, it doesn't distinguish necessarily between a company that's, if you like, ESG advanced or as opposed to one that's just carrying on as normal. But I know the EU is started a work stream on creating EU taxonomy, which is, as I understand it, is creating scientific measures which allow you then to, for lenders to then judge, the risk associated with the ESG or the and therefore then using that to determine the price of capital to that particular company or industry or individual. My concern, I think it sounds right, because we are going to need a lot of capital. My concern is that you all of a sudden you have this situation where the EU is creating this taxonomy and measuring it in one way. The US does it in another way. China does it in another, and that's what for shipping. That then becomes an incredibly dangerous scenario. And it's not. Again, it's back to this not joined up thinking. If you like.
and I mean, this is the great benefit of IMO for the last 50 years, that, you know, it's global legislation. As long as you comply with IMO mandates, you can trade globally. Great, you know, that's been incredibly enabling. But what you're talking about here, Graham, these non-financial metrics, as they're called, actually, I think sustainable investing it's increased by about 68% since 2014. There's over 30 trillion US dollars geared towards sustainable investing. And I mean, there are things like the DJI ESG index, for example. And of course, it's stakeholders, shareholders, investors are looking at this as a window to the future, these ESG scores. But what was interesting in the last year, the World Economic Forum International Business Council came out with these stakeholder capitalism metrics. And their idea was that they got, you know, the KPMGs and the Deloittes and the EYs to look at all of the range of metrics out there and distill them into, I think it's 21 core metrics and 34 expanded ones. So this is, and they call them the stakeholder capitalism metrics. So this is the push by business to meet the challenge of exactly what you've just described. That how do we as multinational organizations, you know, meet our obligations to our investors, our stakeholders around the world in different jurisdictions. So this is a push by business to actually capitalize on the agenda now and say, right, well, we think that these are the metrics that we can all report. And that gives you then credible, standardized reporting. And so there's a big push around that, and I'm working with several companies actually to look at implementing those, and they take into account the GRIs and all sorts of things. But I think this is where the opportunity that you mentioned lies, because this is a spectrum, and there will be some companies who will never get on board with this, who will never really do very much on ESG, but they probably don't have a long-term future. Because what this really comes down to, as I often say, is a deceptively simple question, which is how are we going to create value in future? And ESG is going to fundamentally and materially change how your company creates value in the future. So it's important from that perspective, just to pick up on the thing about people. You know, so many people these days, there was a survey the other day, 76% of people say they don't work for a company just because of the compensation and benefits. It now has to be aligned with their purpose and their values. That's kind of scary. But the thing is, shipping has, you know, you're talking about connecting, you know, countries with aid or whatever it is. You know, you need to be talking about a purpose. Yeah. This needs to be meaningful work, meaningful, purposeful work. And I suspect that crews on vessels have that. People tend to work in small teams together. You know, they look after each other. It's all about safety. You know, most people at sea love being at sea. You know, there's actually an element of doing something that they love as well. But ashore, we're not so much like that. You know, a lot of people do jobs they don't particularly want to do, and they're increasingly saying, I want to work somewhere where I really feel more fulfilled. So I think, you know, if we can move that conversation around to saying, you know, we're more purposeful here. We're not just moving, you know, rubber dog poop from Hong Kong to, you know, Long Beach. We're actually doing something that improves the world. And if that can be cleaning up the health of the oceans, if it can be, you know, improving the lot of seafarers, if it can be monitoring the oceans, all of these things, you know, which we can be a part of in the blue economy of shipping, that is a fantastically attractive story for a new talented generation that we need on board our ships and in our boardrooms.
It's very true, and the last part, Katie, that you pick up on is sort of the crew and all our colleagues at sea has actually made a difference that matters in Corona. They're sort of part of the unsung hero cohort, together with our frontline workers in the sort of healthcare situation, which is phenomenal. What they have been able to accomplish, and yes, we have put them through a lot of stress, but everybody that I have spoken to has actually carried that with mostly pride, because as you say, shipping actually makes a difference to this whole conversation. To me, I think ESG is such a big part of company strategy, but it's a rite of passage. It is fundamentally important that we be an early adopter on all those aspects, because the young generations coming in certainly don't tend to have the conservative aspects that I had when I grew up, you know, and about business, you know, and good for them. So we need to deliver much more value, not only from a P&L perspective, but as a whole. And I think digital that we will speak about in the next panel is a huge part of that, because having access to the right data, you speak about legislation and how they are going to implement some of these things, the transparency that data will be able to deliver to us for us to make decisions on as leading indicators, whereas today, quite frankly, most companies will have them as lagging indicators, and that's all fine. But we really need to cross over and implement data as a completely different aspect of your decision-making value chain, because that will also allow the legislators to opine on, whether EU are delivering on their aspects or China or America. So we don't get that sort of competition that is unfair to use that word. And there's always a risk, but somebody has to start. And I guess intelligent capital will hopefully follow the companies that are proving that rite of passage, proving that journey. And then capital will be less efficient for the regions or the countries or the companies who are actually not in earnest following that. And I think we play a big part in shipping to deliver that research, to deliver those data, and assist the industry in making the right decisions. Because there's not one decision. There are so many aspects of shipping that has different maturity, I guess, both in terms of data and how they see ESG. And I suppose that becomes, and the other part of it, I guess, is, are we looking, and we spoke about that this morning, are we looking at 2030, are we looking at 2050? So, how fast? And that's going to be a very interesting topic over the next.
Yeah, and it's a spectrum, isn't it? Some companies are really leading on this. Yeah. Other companies are just starting to try and understand what the implications are. I said yesterday that, to misquote William Gibson, ESG like the future, it's already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. And I think that is really where we are right now. Yeah. But ultimately, it's very connected to enterprise risk management. Yeah. That's really, I think, where the most interesting, where it will start becoming relevant, because you start saying, well, these may be material risks to our ability to actually trade in the future.
I mean, I kind of agree with everything we've said about the digitalization, but I think the other thing that's kind of slid a little bit off the agenda of late has been the move towards more autonomous ships. I mean, I, for one, I'm not sure that I'll see autonomous ships in my lifetime, but I've been wrong many times. And the one thing I do know is that the rate of change is greater than one you can ever anticipate in a way, or it seems to be that way. So I do think that we really need to think about how we do that in a safe and efficient way, and equip our people in the right way, because and not just equip them in terms of their ability to interface with whatever equipment that the future may hold, but also equip them mentally. Yeah. Because I think the likelihood is we will have less people on board the ships, and during our lifetimes, we've seen a significant decline in the number of people that you typically have on a ship, and that brings its mental challenges. And I think we all are very much aware that the suicide rate among seafarers is much higher than the general population. So in all of this debate around decarbonisation, digitalisation, as an industry, we're obligated really to continue to think about the well-being of our people, and I think that needs to get a little more airtime in different forums than I've certainly experienced of late. So
yeah, I as you know, Graham, I 100% agree with you. But don't you think that generally, so data will play a big part in welfare, and it may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but I fundamentally believe serving up better knowledge around how to navigate the vessel and so on, and how to maintain the vessel and so on, will give a more meaningful sort of discussion. And for the young people, certainly that will give more meaning. I think going all the way to autonomous ships, I'm not even sure that in my lifetime that will happen at a broad scale. And I think the biggest impediment is exactly safety. But also the fact that when we talk about an autonomous vehicle that people are struggling with still, most of the satellites are on the landmass. not on the ocean. And 71% of this fantastic planet is still water. So we need to have a bunch of satellites up there crisscrossing to actually be able to deliver that. So I think it's certainly coming, and we would be wrong not to start planning that and have the conversation with the crew for sure. But right now, welfare, I think data plays a big part of that. We need to do more.
These things are very connected, though,
Yeah.
I think, because when it comes to autonomous vessels, this is not something that's been led by ship owners and operators. This is something that's led by technology companies and suppliers. And actually, when you want to have an autonomous vehicle or an autonomous vessel, it depends on data, right? Available data. And that's, as you say, a lot easier to do on land. But even with one person with one car, it's still extremely difficult. There is absolutely no way that you will be able to remove everybody from a ship until you actually understand what every individual on that ship does every day. And until you can log that, until you know when they knock rust, until you know when they, do something with a latch that otherwise wouldn't be done. Shipping is about making sure the cargo is safe. And the technology companies are talking about we can navigate the vessel, we can berth the vessel. Well, great, okay, but by the way, we already have pilots that do that, but we'll leave that to one side. But when you actually look at what you really need to do to make a fully autonomous vessel, you are going to have to collect so much data and know exactly what all those crew members do before you can actually remove them. And this is the real problem that we're getting now. That if you talk about AI, it all depends on historic data. It uses the past to predict the future. And in uncertain environments, actually, the priority is not to predict. The priority is to adapt. And these kind of systems are not very adaptable at sea. What you really want is somebody who can adapt, and that is a human. So I'm not saying that you can't have technology solutions that are amazing for decision support, but until we reach a point where we can actually put a data point on everything that seafarer does on that vessel, you can't remove them.
I tend to agree, but remember, as I tell everyone, I joined my first ship 50 years ago last week, and at that time we were still learning Morse code and semaphore, and if someone had talked about what the capabilities we have today, we would probably have reported them to the police.
Yeah.
So my point being, I think technology has a habit of surprising you and moving much quicker than you might anticipate. I think we're down to our last couple of minutes here. So shall I just wrap up? Is that okay? Well,
You have the mic.
Yeah. I think the first thing I should say is I think I fulfilled the promise we made at the beginning, is that you wouldn't actually hear any solutions here, and so we didn't give you any solutions. Hopefully we did raise some food for thought. I think in the next 3 sessions, then we'll dig much deeper into some of these topics, and hopefully that for those of you on the line, some 150, I'm now told, in several different countries, then you can participate by sending in your questions and really challenging us, I think, in some of the views that we've articulated this morning. So, René, thank you very much. Katie, thank you, and we'll see us all again during the course of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham.